Hey, what's up? Welcome back to another edition of the Mandatory Live. And this one, a little bit of a special one because we're doing it on Saturday morning, which, Brian, I don't think we've ever done a live on Saturday morning. I know we've done like a couple of hits for the New York Post previewing some fights,
That's
but
true.
we've never done like a live show Saturday morning. But we felt like we couldn't just leave you hanging this week, a busy week for both Brian and I. But we wanted to make time for you guys. So thanks so much for rocking with us. Remember, if you like the content, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Also, follow us on our social media channels. We're at the Mandatory TKO. There's talks that Errol Spence and Sebastian Fundora is actually going to go down. And it's kind of crazy because if Errol Spence wins, he can make Bud Crawford a champion. Is that right? Can you explain?
Boxing scene is reporting that. So I don't even think we have a date for this, like a confirmed actual set in stone concrete date announcement for the pending super welterweight championship clash that is going to be Sebastian Fundora, who, I mean, listen, he won the WBO and WBC titles against Tim Tszyu. Like somehow the WBC just shoehorned their title into this fight. It was vacant beforehand. And when you look at just the rankings, whatever the case may be, like Errol Spence, I don't believe has been categorized other than by the WBC as a contender in this weight class. WBC elevated him to number one because he was their welterweight champion for so long, even though he got his ass whooped by Terrence Crawford, which is well over a year ago at this point, and we don't even have a date for this next fight. So by the time he gets into the ring with Sebastian Fundora, it's going to be post a long layoff, almost 2 years at this point, because we're already talking about closing in on a year and a half in a month or two. So basically, what's going to happen is Sebastian Fundora has WBC and WBO titles. He's going to defend both of them against Errol Spence. But apparently, Errol Spence cannot win the WBO title because the WBO is not here for this fight, so to speak. Like they don't want to put their belt on the line here. And it's probably because Errol Spence, as I just mentioned, is not ranked at all by the WBO at 154, which they're within their right to do that. The WBC has him ranked number one. Boxing is boxing. That's all I can say about that. So basically, Sebastian Fundora has both titles on the line because if he loses the fight, which I think there's a good amount of people that think that's going to be the case, I'm not so sure. But if he loses the fight, Errol Spence gets the WBC, but Terrence Crawford gets the WBO title because Terrence Crawford is the interim champion and he would get promoted to full champion if Sebastian Fundora loses this fight. But if Sebastian Fundora wins this fight, no harm, no foul. He retains both titles, no changes. And Errol Spence, his career is in jeopardy at that point. So Errol Spence could effectively make Terrence Crawford a world champion. Um, a unified world champion in this weight class because he already has the WBA title. He could also get the WBO. And the shit that Terrence Crawford would talk after that. After like I beat you and then you made me a champion like a second time after that.
You
Like
know
type
what?
of shit.
I think there's a little bit more respect between Bud and Spence, especially after the way Spence lost. Like I think Bud handled that really well. The only
The
time
way
I've
he
seen
whooped his
them
ass? Is that what you're saying?
no, the way he acted after the fight, post fight, like he wasn't
Well,
acting like, that he was better than Spence. Like we saw that. We saw that in the ring. Like Bud had
sure.
nothing to prove at that point, and he wasn't throwing it in his face. The only time I feel like Bud said something is when they moved up to 154 and Spence was like, "Yo, I want to fight this person," and Bud was like, "You're gonna have to wait." And I think that was Fundora. But
Well,
listen, there is a road where Spence and Bud could fight again at 154
yep.
pounds. And this is probably the most interesting factor of this whole entire discussion that's going on. So Spence could initially make Bud a champion, and then there's a chance we could get a second fight between Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. And this would be at 154 pounds. Now, remember, Spence had a lot of trouble cutting down to 147 pounds. And before the Bud Crawford fight, I saw a lot of people riding for Spence.
Yeah.
A lot of people riding for
Mhm.
Spence. And they thought that he was going to beat Bud, and then he gets absolutely destroyed in the ring. I've never seen Spence get beat up like that ever. Nobody ever did because he never lost before. But at 154 pounds, it makes it a little bit interesting. And I wonder how many people might want to place their money on Spence in that fight at 154 pounds if he's not cutting down to 147.
I'd be very hesitant to do that based off the last performance, based off the layoff, based off Sebastian Fundora beating Tim Zhu. Although you could really criticize him and be like, hey, he only won because Tim Zhu had a nasty cut that he was trying to fight through.
That was one of my that was one of
Takeaways.
my takeaways for sure in that
Yeah.
fight. But then Tim Zhu comes back in his next fight, and what happened there?
Well,
The
no, I think we just slept on, and we should actually bring this up because if Errol Spence wins it, well, regardless of who wins this fight, whoever wins this fight, we're gonna have a unified champion in this weight class, and that's important because Terrence Crawford has WBA, Sebastian Fundora has WBC and the WBO at this point. It's worth noting that the WBC interim title is held by Virgil Ortiz, and he's still in line to fight Israel Madrimov, whose fight got canceled coming up, so he's gonna have more time to rest leading up to that fight in February. So there's a lot going on with that. And that fight actually may happen before we even get a resolution to this. But if Sebastian Fundora wins this fight and retains both titles, you still have Terrence Crawford and you still have Bakram Murtazayev. Hopefully I didn't murder his last name, but that's a tough one. But he beat the shit out of Tim Zhu in October, as you were just talking about. And if Errol Spence wins this, then Terrence Crawford has multiple titles. So like you're getting closer to an actual undisputed scenario at 154 that could play out over the course of the year. It could even turn into like a little tournament between
yes,
like Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence, Sebastian Fundora, the winner of that, the winner of Virgil Ortiz and Madrimov, and then you have Murtazayev over there. So like
the
there's
only
there's really
issue
good fights to make it this weight class.
the only issue is that we're only going to see Bud fight once next year. Like, let's be serious here. We're going to see him fight. Like, when was the last time we saw him have two fights?
To 2019.
It's been a minute. We're going to
That
see
was
Bud fight.
Amir Khan and Meme Machine. I was at both of those.
What I think is going to happen is he's going to have one fight next year, and then if Spence was to win this fight against Fundora, then there is going to be the talk about, hey, could this fight happen again? Like, it could possibly be the same thing, which would be extremely annoying. But the other aspect of this is, if Spence loses to Fundora, he should just hang up the gloves.
Yeah.
Like, at that point, I don't think people would want to see Spence in the ring again. And depending on how he loses, but he shouldn't lose to Fundora. No disrespect to Sebastian Fundora, but we haven't seen Spence at 154 pounds. But if you think about it, he was one of the kings of the welterweight division for such a long time. But you got to think about the accident, how much that had an effect, the eye injury. Like, Spence has been through a lot of injuries at this point of his career. He's on the side of the latter end of his career. So the Errol Spence Jr. that we get, that's going to be interesting, especially after an extremely long layoff.
Yeah.
So I'm not even sure what type of Spence that we're going to see in the ring, and I think that's the most interesting. Brian, any final thoughts before we move away from this topic?
We should note that Errol Spence turns 35 in March, and there's a chance that this fight doesn't happen until after his 35th birthday. So he would potentially be 35. He'd be coming off a layoff that again, like it's coming up on 2 years pretty soon. If this doesn't happen till the summer, then you're talking about him having not fought since July of 2023. And that's a long ass time. When we were talking about that fight, I was living in an entirely different place. You know what I mean? When we were talking about Crawford versus Spence. And before that, he had a long layoff because he fought Ugas, Yordenis Ugas, in April of 2022. And before that, he had a long layoff because he fought Danny Garcia toward the end of 2020. That was in December. And before that, he had a long layoff because he fought Sean Porter in September of 2019. Like Errol Spence has had between his last four fights, the layoffs, he's had, or between his last three fights, 15 months, 16 months, and then 15 months again. And this will be whenever he decides to fight
Yeah.
Sebastian Fundora, it'll be basically his fifth fight in about 6 years
Sheesh.
for somebody who's 35 years old and for somebody who just got their ass whooped in this last fight. And for somebody, honestly, like we talked about this, who got by the Sean Porter fight, like barely. That was a
Yeah, it
very
was a
close
draw.
fight.
I scored it as a draw, and I will still stand by that. That fight was a draw, but I feel like he's the layoff king. Just labeling him as the layoff king at this point because the dude just takes the longest time to come back in the ring. But I mean, there were some injuries involved and stuff like that. There was also a car accident. So
And COVID.
there, yeah. So I mean, those things have to play into effect as well. But
Mhm.
drop in the comments, guys, how you think Spence is going to look in his return, and if you have confidence in him at 154 pounds. We will obviously, read your comments if you drop them on the live, but at the same time, we always check those comments. So please drop your comments because this is an interactive show.